All right, so you're into philosophy, and you want to wrap your head around how it tackles this whole idea of childhood. Well, you're in for a treat because we're going deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on, you guessed it, the philosophy of childhood.
It's a real eye-opener. It's not just about defining what a child is, but it delves into all these fascinating questions about their minds, their morals, and even the whole concept of children's rights.
It really makes you think about how our views of kids have evolved, right? Like,
Yeah.
one thing that jumped out at me was how medieval art often depicted children as, well, just mini adults.
Yeah, almost like they weren't even seen as their own distinct phase of life.
Exactly. Like they were just expected to act and think like grown-ups, which honestly seems a bit unfair, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And it feeds into this long-standing idea, what we call the Aristotelian conception of childhood, where a child is basically an immature adult, constantly striving to reach their full potential.
So it's like this never-ending, you're not there yet kind of
Right.
situation.
Pretty much. But then things get even wilder when you look at the 19th century, where some folks thought a person's development mirrored the entire evolution of the human species. It's like they were trying to cram all of human history into a single childhood.
Talk about pressure. But it's interesting how this idea of a child always lacking something compared to an adult, this deficit conception, can really limit how we see their capabilities, right?
Absolutely. It overlooks all the amazing and unique ways children think and experience the world.
Which brings us to this whole fascinating area of cognitive development.
Hmm.
I mean, how do these little brains go from, well, knowing nothing to understanding everything? There's got to be more to it than just rote memorization, Chad.
Spot on. And philosophers have been grappling with this question for ages. You've got Descartes, who believed in innate knowledge, like we're born with certain ideas already wired into our brains. Then you've got Locke with his famous blank slate theory, where everything comes from experience.
Right, nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
And that's where Chomsky's work on language comes in, right? His theory of universal grammar really shook things up, arguing that kids learn language way too fast for it to be just from mimicking what they hear.
Exactly. There has to be some innate structure in our brains that helps us acquire language so quickly. And then, of course, we can't forget Piaget, a giant in the field of child development.
Mm.
His stage theory of cognitive development argues that kids go through these distinct leaps in their understanding. Like those classic experiments where he'd ask kids how they understood concepts like life.
Oh, yeah, like how younger kids might think anything that moves is alive, but then they later realize that plants are alive too, even though they don't run around.
Right. It shows how their thinking evolves and gets more complex over time.
It's amazing to think about, but the source also points out that even Piaget's work had its critics.
Oh, for sure. Some argue that he focused too much on what children couldn't do compared to adults, and his methods, which often relied on verbal questioning, might have underestimated younger kids. It highlights how tricky it is to really understand what's going on in a child's mind.
It's like trying to decipher a secret code. So,
Mhm.
we've talked about how children think, but what about how they develop a sense of right and wrong? That seems like a whole other level of complexity.
It definitely is, and it's something philosophers have debated for centuries. You've got the big names like Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, all weighing in with their theories. But to really get into the nitty-gritty, we need to jump ahead to Rousseau and his five-stage model of moral development.
So Rousseau, he was the one who believed that true moral reasoning doesn't really kick in until adolescence.
Exactly. Before that, it's more about rewards and punishments. Kids are mainly motivated by avoiding trouble or pleasing the adults around them.
So it's like their internal moral compass is still developing.
Precisely. And later on, psychologists like Piaget and Kohlberg built upon these ideas. Kohlberg, in particular, is known for his six-stage theory of moral development, which has had a massive influence on how we view children's morality even today.
And Kohlberg was the one who used those moral dilemmas to test people's stages of reasoning, right? Like the famous Heinz dilemma, where the guy has to decide whether to steal a life-saving drug for his dying wife.
Yes. And according to Kohlberg, not everyone even reaches those final stages of moral reasoning, even as adults.
Wow, that's pretty thought-provoking. And it reminds me of Carol Gilligan's critique of Kohlberg's model. She argued that his focus on these abstract principles of justice missed a key element, the care perspective.
Right, the idea that empathy and compassion are just as important as following the rules.
So it's not just about knowing right from wrong, but also about understanding the impact our actions have on others.
Exactly, and this raises all sorts of interesting questions about how children develop this sense of care and responsibility, which we'll definitely explore further.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance, isn't it? Like, how do we acknowledge a child's growing sense of right and wrong while still recognizing they need guidance and protection?
It's a tough one. And all this talk about morals makes me think about this concept of moral status, which the source brings up. To be honest, it sounds a bit intimidating, like some kind of judgment system.
Oh, I totally get that. It can sound a bit technical, but moral status is basically about whether a being, like a person or even an animal, deserves moral consideration. Do we have obligations towards them? Should their interests matter when we make decisions?
So it's less about judging their character and more about recognizing their inherent worth, right? Like, do they have value simply because they exist?
Exactly. And this gets really interesting when we're talking about children. With adults, most people agree they have full moral status. They can reason, make choices, understand consequences, all those things we associate with being a responsible person. But kids are still like developing those capacities. Does that mean they have less moral status than adults?
That's the big question philosophers are wrestling with. And there are a few different ways to approach it. One way is to link moral status to a being's potential.
So even if a child can't do everything an adult can, they still deserve consideration because they have the potential to develop those abilities.
Yeah.
Like we wouldn't harm a caterpillar because we know we'll become a butterfly someday.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And it just feels right, doesn't it? Part of why it's wrong to harm a child is because you're taking away their chance to grow into a morally responsible person.
But what about children who might not reach that full potential, like children with severe disabilities? Would they have less moral status in this view? It seems a bit iffy to me.
You've hit on one of the big problems with this approach. It can create this hierarchy of moral worth, which a lot of philosophers find troubling. That's why there are other approaches that don't solely rely on potential.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of those other views?
Well, one approach focuses on sentience, the capacity for experiencing things, both positive and negative. It's about recognizing that a being can feel pleasure and pain.
So even if a child can't, like, fully grasp complex moral concepts, the fact that they can feel joy or suffer harm gives them moral standing.
Exactly. This aligns with certain ethical frameworks like utilitarianism, which you might have heard of.
Yeah, that makes sense. Even babies clearly react to their environment and express emotions. It's obvious they're experiencing the world in a very real way.
Absolutely. And this view can even extend beyond humans to include animals who show signs of sentience. But for now, let's stick with the kids.
All right, back to the little humans. Any other perspectives on their moral status we should know about?
Well, there's another interesting view that focuses on relationships and their moral significance. The idea is that beings gain moral status through their connections with others, particularly those who already have it.
So a child's relationships with their family, friends, community, all those bonds contribute to their moral worth. It's not just about what they can do on their own, but their place within a network of connections.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those moral responsibilities that come with relationships. We have obligations to children not just because of some quality they possess, but because they are a part of our lives and communities.
I like that. It feels more holistic, like it acknowledges how we're all connected. But does that mean a child without strong connections has less moral worth? That doesn't seem quite right either.
You raise a valid point, and it's something philosophers are still debating. The key takeaway here is that there are many ways to think about moral status, and they can even work together.
It sounds like we're moving away from this black and white thinking and towards a more nuanced view of childhood. Instead of always focusing on what children lack compared to adults, we're starting to appreciate their unique experiences and relationships.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of the philosophy of childhood, the concept of childhood agency.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not totally sure what it means. Is it just another way of saying kids have free will?
It is related to free will, but it's a bit more specific. Childhood agency is about recognizing that children, even very young ones, are actively shaping their lives. They have preferences, they make choices, they express their will, and they influence their environment, even in small ways.
So it's not just adults acting upon children, but acknowledging that children are actors too, like they could make things happen.
Precisely. And recognizing childhood agency is super important for how we interact with children, how we make policies that affect them, and how we think about their rights.
This makes me think of that story we talked about earlier about Gregory K., the 12-year-old who successfully advocated for new adoptive parents. That's a powerful example of a child using his agency within a system that often doesn't give kids much say.
It's a great example, and it highlights how important it is to create spaces where children can express their views and have those views taken seriously, even if the adults ultimately make the final decisions.
It's like we're finally moving past that old saying, children should be seen and not heard. We're recognizing they have valuable insights to share.
Right. And recognizing childhood agency is really connected to that earlier discussion about autonomy. We often think of autonomy as something adults have, that ability to make choices freely. But how does that apply to children who are, by nature, dependent on adults?
That's a tricky one for sure. We don't want to burden them with adult responsibilities or put them in danger, but we also don't want to stifle their growing sense of self and their ability to make choices.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it? Philosophers have been exploring this idea of relational autonomy, which suggests that a child's autonomy develops within the context of their relationships with caring adults.
So it's not about giving them complete freedom, but providing support and guidance so they can make age-appropriate choices and learn to make decisions for themselves.
Exactly. It's about giving them information, explaining the reasons behind things, and offering choices within boundaries.
Like building a support system around their developing autonomy, allowing them to explore and make choices safely.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, a child's capacity for autonomy will change depending on their age, development, and circumstances. A 5-year-old won't have the same level of autonomy as a 15-year-old. It's a gradual process.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Definitely not. It's about meeting each child where they are.
It seems like this whole discussion of childhood agency and autonomy really challenges that deficit view we discussed earlier. Instead of just seeing kids as incomplete adults, we're recognizing them as individuals with unique abilities and values.
You're absolutely right. And this shifting perspective leads us into a fascinating area of the philosophy of childhood, the goods of childhood.
Goods of childhood. I'm intrigued. Is it just about having good health and a good education? Or is there something more to it?
It's definitely more than just the basics. We're talking about what's inherently good about being a child, not just what's good for them in some practical way.
Okay, I need an example.
Think back to those refrigerator art masterpieces we mentioned earlier. They might not be, museum worthy, but they represent something pure and joyful about childhood creativity. That sense of wonder, that freedom to explore, that pure delight in creating, that's all part of the goods of childhood.
So it's about appreciating those unique experiences and qualities of childhood itself, not just seeing it as a stepping stone to adulthood, like rediscovering the magic of being a kid.
Exactly. And philosophers are arguing these experiences have value in and of themselves. They enrich a child's life now, regardless of whether they lead to success later.
It makes me want to build a fort out of blankets right now.
Yeah.
We really do need to remember those simple joys sometimes.
I think you've hit on something important. Recognizing the inherent value of childhood experiences has implications for how we structure children's lives, how we design education, and even how we shape social policies.
This is so much bigger than just some abstract philosophy, isn't it? It's about real-world change in how we see and treat children.
Absolutely. As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's worth pondering this. If we truly believe childhood has intrinsic worth, how should that change the way we interact with children, educate them, and create a world that truly values them?
It really is. And it leads me to something we haven't touched on much yet, this idea of children and philosophy itself. We often think of philosophy as this dense, complicated subject that only adults can handle. But what if we've been selling kids short?
I think that's a misconception that's finally starting to change. There's this growing awareness that kids are natural philosophers. They have this innate curiosity, this desire to understand the world around them, and they aren't afraid to ask those big questions, the ones we adults often avoid.
Oh, absolutely. I remember driving my parents crazy with why questions when I was a kid. It's like I wanted to figure out the meaning of everything. But it seems like we kind of lose that as we get older.
Yeah, we get bogged down with everyday life, or we just start accepting things without questioning them. And that's where introducing kids to philosophy can be so powerful. It's about nurturing that natural curiosity they have, giving them the tools to articulate those big questions they're already asking.
It makes sense. But it's not just about making them little intellectuals, right?
Right. It goes beyond just stimulating their minds. Philosophy can help them develop critical thinking skills, learn to see things from different perspectives, and even become more empathetic and engaged members of society.
So how do you actually do philosophy? Because do you just hand them a copy of Plato and say, good luck?
Not quite. It's about finding ways to spark their curiosity and encourage deep thinking that's appropriate for their age. There's actually a whole movement called Philosophy for Children, or P4C for short, that focuses on just that.
P4C. Interesting. Tell me more.
Well, it's based on the idea that philosophy shouldn't be locked away in universities. It should be for everyone, kids included. And P4C programs are popping up everywhere: schools, libraries, community centers. It's really gaining momentum.
That's pretty cool. So what does a typical P4C session look like?
It usually starts with something that sparks philosophical questions, a stimulus like a story, a poem, a picture, even something happening in the news. Then the kids take the lead. They share their thoughts, ask questions, debate each other's ideas. The facilitator is there to guide the discussion, make sure everyone feels heard and respected. But the real magic happens in that back and forth between the kids.
I bet those conversations can get pretty deep. I can imagine them coming up with insights that would surprise even the most experienced philosophers.
Oh, it happens all the time. Kids have this fresh perspective, this ability to see things in new ways, and they're not afraid to question assumptions, to think outside the box.
It's like they remind us what it means to be genuinely curious and open-minded. But beyond the intellectual benefits, what kind of impact does engaging with philosophy have on kids more broadly?
It can be pretty profound, actually. It can boost their self-esteem, improve how they communicate, and even help them develop a stronger sense of self and purpose. They learn to think for themselves, to express their values, and to engage with the world in a more thoughtful and caring way.
Wow, that's really impressive. This whole conversation has really changed how I think about children and philosophy. It's easy to assume they're too young or immature for these big ideas, but clearly we've been underestimating them.
I agree completely. And it circles back to what we've been talking about this whole time, this idea of recognizing the inherent worth of childhood. It's not just about getting kids ready for adulthood, but appreciating their unique ways of thinking, feeling, and experiencing the world.
It's about seeing them as whole people, not just unfinished adults. And part of that is nurturing their ability to think philosophically, to grapple with those big questions and find their own answers.
You said it. It's about empowering them to become active, engaged members of society. People who can think critically, make ethical decisions, and make a positive impact on the world.
Well said. And to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating world of childhood and philosophy. There's so much to learn, not just from experts, but from the kids in your lives, too.
Don't underestimate their sense of wonder, their desire to learn, or their ability to challenge your own thinking. You might be surprised by what they teach you.
Because inside every child, there's a philosopher waiting to be discovered. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the philosophy of childhood.